Hi, everyone. My name is Jamília Pinheiro Dias, and on behalf of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies here at the School of Advanced Study at the University of London, I would like to welcome you all to another Germinations event. For those of you who might not be familiar with this series, we are coming together to discuss environmental humanities in Latin America. This season of Germinations is being co-organized by our colleagues Anoa Montoya from the School of Advanced Study, Lisa Blackmore from the University of Essex, Paul Merchant from the University of Bristol, Alejandro Ponce de Leon from CLEX as well, and UC Davis, as well as myself. And together we are convening conversations with researchers, practitioners working across theoretical approaches, arts, sciences, intersections, techno-legal landscapes, and cultural production that deal with amphibious modes of being and doing. So I invite you to have a look at the Germinations page on the website of CLEX and the School of Advanced Study here at the University of London. Just a bit of housekeeping. This event is being recorded, so if you want to ask a question but do not want to appear in the recording, please put it in the chat. And consider registering to join us for next week's event on environmental film in Brazil, with actress Maeve Jenkins and filmmaker Fernando Sektovic, who will be discussing audiovisual production around utilitarian imaginaries of water and earth. So thank you for joining us. Alejandro will be introducing our wonderful speaker, Andrea Ballesteros. So over to you, Alejandro.
Thank you very much, Jamília. Analytics are matters that matter. As a continental shockwave, extractivist formations from Chile's lithium brine to El Salvador Bitcoin rush are compromising access to water at scales and intensities that model very principles of what is possible, visible, and utterable about these bodies of water in the Americas. Contesting these modes of geologic thinking, activists and researchers in the region are fostering what I want to call amphibious modes of analysis that suspend geopolitical idioms, figure ground, water, earth, life, non-life, being, non-being, while activating new modes of awareness and engagement with the forces shaping this common hydro-geo-social existence. We could also refer this mode of attending, borrowing from Cristina Rivera-Garza's work, as de-sedimenting analytics, the uncovering of social life of geology, both as a language and as a practice of accumulation, by attending to its inhuman, anti-human, and more than human dimensions, while producing distinct modes of accounting that exceed the objectivity of these geological formations. Today, I have the joy of being in conversation with anthropologist Andrea Ballesteros, who will be talking about her ongoing work and modes of accounting for the unknown or maybe changing conditions of aquifers in Costa Rica, a country that currently is grappling with water scarcity, contamination, and of course, even distribution. Neither land nor water, aquifers are formations with blurred borders between the rock, water, and air. Rather than seen or felt, they are imagined. To geologists and activists alike, the structures challenge the easy separation between content and container that it's intrinsic to extractive ways of managing underground waters. How can this indeterminacy be analytically addressed? What are the politics mobilized around such modes of attending this materiality? Andrea Ballesteros is an anthropologist whose interests span in political and legal anthropology, science and technology studies, and the social studies of finance and economy. She serves as faculty member in the anthropology department at the University of Southern California. Her research illuminates the unexpected ethical and technical entanglements through which experts understand water in Latin America, with a keen focus on spaces where law, economics, and technoscience merge. Welcome, Andrea, to Germinations.
Thank you very much, Alejandro, Jamile, Lisa, Kathy, Paul. It's really wonderful to be here, and to all of the people that are with us this morning. As we were talking before, it's this format of a conversation is one of the things that one of maybe the few good things that the pandemic left for us, this online conversation. So I'm pretty much thinking and excited about the dynamic discussion that will follow. And thank you so much for that introduction, Alejandro. Should I just jump into it, or yes? Okay. So let me then share my screen. What I'm going to do is make a short presentation. I'm not going to read a paper. I decided to talk off of the images that I have here that I have prepared to share with you. This is going to take between 10 and 15 minutes. And then after that, we'll jump into the more conversational part of the session. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is, in a way, a moment in which the analytics of matter that matter, to put it in Alejandro's beautiful phrasing, how I'm coming to think about these issues that I've been learning from for a while now. And as Alejandro mentioned, I'm doing this work in Costa Rica, which is also the country that I'm from. And it's a project that started by allowing myself to be pulled in a direction that was unexpected. So I began hearing about aquifers. I began learning about aquifers when I was completing my previous work on the human right to water. And so at this moment, what I want to put on the table, if you will, is this notion of joining forces, and what kinds of devices or what kinds of points of intersection might be conducive to joining forces with all forms of imagining aquifers, so that we can conceive of better ways to live with and through them. And the other thing that was important to me about this project, which was, again, something that I had to just accept and go with, is this idea of turning downwards. So thinking and orienting yourself towards that which lies beneath, rather than that which is at a horizontal level with you, or that which sits above. Although, of course, I like to think about this as an orientation rather than an exclusionary partition. So it's not that you don't think about the horizontal or what sits above, but the difference is what happens when you start by looking downwards. So in terms of looking downwards, this is an image that circulates widely and that in a way dominates extractivist understandings of the underground. This geological substrate, which is a set of layers that operate as records of different times, all deep. The deeper you go, the deeper the time is. And all of you that work in environmental questions, I don't need to say a lot about the significance of these kind of visual and volumetric imagination for our current moment. But the issue that I have with this presentation is the notion of stasis and the clarity and the orderly way in which it presents the geological substrate, something that has led to arguments about how the geological sits beyond human scales, how it is impossible to understand, how it moves or changes at such a slow speed that it's inaccessible to the human. And if you come maybe from Colombia, definitely from Costa Rica, and so many other countries around the world, the geologic substrate is anything but fixed. If I can only tell you how many earthquakes I felt when I was in Costa Rica recently, I can tell you about the smell of ash or sulfur coming from our active volcanoes. I can tell you about the ash clouds that are constantly coming out of our volcanoes. So that the geologic is not universally fixed or static, is what I'm trying to say. And we also find back in history, very early on, moments in which in the Western tradition, this dynamism was recognized. So it wasn't, the static image of layers wasn't the dominant view of something that we might call geological, even if at this time we weren't thinking about geology the way in which we're thinking about it in connection to modern science. So my project connects this, if you will, pre-modern imagination that I showed you in this previous image, the contemporary sense of the geologic is always moving and changing, and another scale that we might call planetary, at which we're being asked to think about the ways in which human presence is leaving a geological mark in the planet. And what you have in front of you is a piece of news that appeared in the New York Times, noting how in the around the start of the 2000s, the axis of the Earth was changing. And so this is clearly a planetary event. And one of the reasons why this axis is changing is because of the amount of groundwater that has been extracted and moved into a different part of the world. And so just the act of the volume and the scale of quantity of water that has been extracted is actually shifting the axis of the Earth. At a planetary scale or at a national scale, we see tons of projects that are dealing with these questions. This is one that Costa Rica engaged in, started in 2017. And the dream was to map all of the country's aquifers. And this was a project that was conducted with the USGS, the Geological Service of the United States. And this kind of project unfolds in a context of all sorts of conflicts that have exploded in recent times, but these are conflicts that carry on legacies of capitalism, of racism, and a number of forces that actually find new forms of expression around these questions. What you have in front of you is this one. It's an image of a mobilization of communities on the Pacific coast of Costa Rica, resisting the movement of water to luxury tourism establishments. As you probably have heard, my country has become an object of desire, a global object of desire for a variety of reasons, and that is having huge economic consequences for local populations. What you have here, the bottom two images, what you have on the right is a pineapple plantation. If you eat pineapples, you're probably eating pineapples from Costa Rica. It doesn't matter where you are, because Costa Rica is today the largest pineapple exporter in the world. As a result, plantations have expanded and groundwater sources have been polluted. And communities that for a long time used to have very good water sources that they extracted from the underground are now being served by water trucks or have had to be served for years and years by water trucks until new infrastructures were built to bring their water from elsewhere. So it is in this context of these pressures that I've been working. And in my previous work, as I mentioned, I was interested in thinking about the kinds of techno-legal devices that shaped the notion of the human right to water. But that project was squarely located on the legal and the economic realm. And one of the things that I learned from that project was to really stay connected to the very micro technical politics that actually unleash major consequences at a larger scale. And that inspiration I carry on to the current project, where I'm still thinking about devices, but I'm now moving into a more spatial and material kind of analysis. In doing so, I've been drawing inspiration from Sylvia Wynter, and the proposal that she makes in terms of what counts as critical analysis and what counts as critical thinking. And I was really taken by her invitation to think with deciphering practices. And these deciphering practices are not so concerned with figuring out what something means, so unearthing a particular meaning, but rather to asking what is it that meaning does in the world? What are its implications? And so for the project that I'm working on, this idea of implications and the construction of meaning is tied, as Alejandro mentioned, to the imagination directly, because aquifers cannot be accessed the way that you can access a river, a lake, a pipe. Aquifers are always remain inaccessible for direct experience. And so they have to be mediated in all sorts of ways. And so I'm here interested in what are the technoscientific means that people are using to produce that mediation, to create that meaning. Not to describe what that meaning is, but then to ask, what does creating meaning through these resources do to aquifers and to how people relate to them? This map that you have in front of you is one of the results of that collaboration between the Costa Rican state and the USGS. They produced, as you can see, they're very striking visual objects. This one is a map of the potential presence of aquifers. This one applies to 30 to 150 meters under the surface. And so this is all a probabilistic game of saying there might be aquifers that can be used by humans at this depth in these parts of the country. This is another of the ways in which people create meaning to do things. I became very early on in the project captivated by this model, which is used by state officials who work with community organizations to try to make sense about what an aquifer is and how it works. And they pair this model with storytelling that they use to emphasize different dynamics in an aquifer. How does pollution move, for instance, or how extraction in one well, each of those little tubes is supposed to be a well, how extraction in one well, as they say, dries out another person's well. What is the role of rain and precipitation? What you see in front of you now, it's precipitation. And so it's a practice of storytelling that is supposed to bring aquifers closer to people's sense of space, sense of matter, without reducing the aquifer to a quantity of water. That is what is at stake here is more, is there enough water or not? But what are the dynamics, the geological or hydro-geological, I should say, dynamics at play? And there's, of course, the sponge, which is something that very early on was presented to me as the most accurate way to think about what an aquifer is, as a structure that it contracts and expands depending on how much water comes in or how much water that is extracted, and a structure that's also defined by pores. And so in terms of the form of the aquifer itself, this idea that the aquifer is a tank, an empty box filled with water, for instance, which is geologically not accurate, is one that I was asked very quickly to move away from and begin to think through pores and porous formations. And what in the context of the projects that I've been following, what that does is invite people to imagine movement in a very different way than when you have a tank in your mind. That is, porous movement is movement that is always in friction and moving through cavities and finding open spaces, rather than the frictionless notion of a container that is holding something that you can pull out any moment. And of course, the technical, the scientific way of thinking about those layers. You see the layers that I showed you first, the very first image that I showed you, those layers are very different from these ones, right? And this is more like the kind of geological structure that we find in Costa Rica. It's actually from one of their studies. And so that moving away from that standardized, orderly set of layers into one of the hydrogeologists that I work with described one of the aquifers that we're learning from as a picadillo. And I don't know, I still haven't found a way to translate into English. It's a chopped up something, but it's also a food in Costa Rica. So un picadillo is something that has very little pieces of a lot of things. And so what happens when a geological structure is a picadillo rather than a set of orderly layers, how that changes what is expected from people as they're asked to protect these formations. And this is a well, this is a monitoring well, I should say. And the well occupies a really important place in this formation that is this hydro-geo-social formation that I'm interested in. It's a charismatic object. It's also a window into forms of extraction, but it's also a tool for monitoring and for understanding the health of an aquifer and water levels. And so joining forces with something like this, when you were not only thinking about it as a means of extraction, but also as a means of monitoring and protection, opens different ways of narrating aquifers. And when you aggregate, then things look very different. This is an image from a national database of all the registered wells in Costa Rica. So each of those little dots, it's equivalent to something like what I just showed you on the image before. And so thinking about another metaphor that people used to think about the underground and in connection to wells is something like a Swiss cheese, something that is filled with these holes that in the aggregate have really serious consequences for future water availability. But I should add that what you're seeing in front of you are the registered wells. There's at least half of this quantity, and this is speculation on my part because you never know, that are unregistered wells in the country. So think about this map and now add 50% more to consider the actual number of wells that exist in a country like mine. And so our idea of the underground as this solid, standardized, filled set of layers begins to look very, very differently when you have this number of perforations in it. So this is an image of a subgroup of the colleagues that I've been working with in Costa Rica. They are government officials and community leaders that manage community water organizations, that is, the organizations that deliver water for local residents. This is on the Caribbean coast, which is the part that I am spending more time with. This is the city of Limon, where I was born. This is APM Terminals, which is is a port that about 10 years ago moved from, actually, I should explain that differently. There used to be, up until about 10 years ago, a state-run port that was the main port through which all of the imports and exports moved. There was a privatization process. This new mega port was built. It was given to the Dutch in administration, and it sits right in front of the aquifer that I'm studying, which is this one. These are the boundaries of the aquifer system that I'm looking into more detail. And that picture that you saw was around here. So this community organization takes water from the aquifer and provides it to all of these people and industry that sit here. And it goes all the way here, actually, the service that they provide. So they are a community organization that all of a sudden finds themselves providing water to all of these import-export industry that is settling in the area. And this is another picture of a meeting that we had discussing needs that they were putting in front of the groundwater agency in Costa Rica. So I think I'm going to stop here because I've been going for a while, and maybe I'm happy to expand on more specifics about this or to go in a different direction. And I'm going to stop sharing now.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for all this beautiful images, and you're such an insightful work around them. So I want to start just one of the elements that brings us together, or what concepts that bring us together to this space has to do with the amphibious practices. And amphibious, we are expanding that notion in many regards. But I think that at the core of your practice, that there's some sense of amphibiedad in terms of the capacity to be both in land and in water and attending to those motions. Out of the work that you've done, just to rephrase a little bit of how I'm thinking about, you are attending to these practices that are forming models and that are forming aquifers, images. Out of them all, I personally think that the model of the aquífero, it's really affectively effective, the plastic one. And what I'm trying to go here is to say, with that opening sentence that you proposed, that you came to this place because it moves you. And I think that in that sponginess of as an analytics that you are tracing, I can also see how your own analytics and your own empiricals are also operating as a sponge, in the sense that it's absorbing, contracting, pulling us in different ways. So it's working in both ways. So it's an analytics that you're looking, but it's also provoking or reframing what anthropological or ethnographic or environmental humanities thinking can do when encountering with forms that are not stable or not grounded, because that is what's at stake. So thinking along those lines, I was also thinking how, we're going to have certainly a lot to talk about the image part of your work, but I want to start in a different place so we can get there. How your own work, your own analytics are sponge forms, in the sense that they're offering other ways of moving us, structuring, conveying, maybe one way of thinking about it, and not only conveying an audience of people engage with your work, but also I think something that is really provoking for this kind of thinking is Silvia Rivera-Garza's notion of communities of affinity, comunidad de afinidad. Just this idea that maybe the future of togetherness, call it political or ethical, is not around nations, but about bodies of water, about mountains being together through an affinity. And she says something that I found really beautiful. She says, que sean los ríos los que nos convoquen. So it's the body that is convocar, which doesn't really translate well to Spanish, to English, but you can call it summoning or calling us forward. So I'm trying to think about your own analytics. Maybe that is the question that I'm trying to phrase here. How your own analytics, it's not only an amplification of an empirics, but also at the core, there's a playfulness between abstract and concrete, that it's always pushing us forward, inciting other practices of thinking together. And in that thinking together, convocar mundos amphibious, amphibian worlds.
Thank you, Alejandro. That was wonderful. You gave me so many things to think with. Maybe I'll start with that last part. I think you captured it so beautifully. One of the things, maybe I'll start general and I'll get to the specifics. One of the things that since my early work I've been very attentive to is how the people that I work with in Costa Rica, either the people that work in regulatory agencies before or NGOs, or now as well the people that you saw in these images, how to them it is not very interesting that I come and convey to them what they have told me. Right, this gesture that sometimes we call of extractivist knowledge production, that I go and note what they think, and then I put that into some sort of academic outcome and give it back to them and colleagues, of course, in academia, because you all are my interlocutors as well. And so since my dissertation time, I've been thinking, how do I not do that? How do I not write something that is self-evident to my collaborators? Because that is sort of like, for them, it's like, okay, yeah, we know what we think, right? And so throughout my work, I've always been struggling about how to do that. How do you create a modality of academic production that is not to convey what A thinks to be, that is also not very clearly activist research, because it's not. It is something else, but it's not that. So what is that something else that it is? And so I, in my first project, the way I resolved temporarily that issue was trying to pinpoint the things that people are curious about that they don't have answers for. So people in these kinds of associations wanted to know, okay, how is it that people are setting the price that I have to charge here? Who is doing that and where? And that's how I ended up at a regulatory agency. Here in this project, it is a little bit different because what is really striking is this struggle, in a good sense of the word, to think about aquifers. So aquifers are an exciting intellectual proposition, in addition to a headache, because sometimes pipes break and you have to fix them, in addition to a lifeline, because you depend on its water for your daily activities. But there's also this intellectually slippery thing for my collaborators. It's not clear what they are. And people move from one image, from one description to another. And so for this project, it is that movement, that going from one sense to another, that I'm borrowing from my collaborators to structure what this project can be. Hence the sponginess or the movement that you nicely identify in the analytics. So those analytics are something that I learned from my collaborators that they are curious about, and that when I tell them what I do, it's kind of interesting to them because it's not me telling them, oh, here you have X difficulty with X industry. They know that. That's their daily life. That's their struggle, political struggle, right? And so what they're more interested that I can offer is something around that movement from one analytics to another. And so my answer to your point is just saying how I got there, and how, as you nicely put it, it's not about conveying something. It's not about conveying a finding, but it's about convocar a conversation that is interesting to them as well. Now, this does not mean that there are not what I've described, let me put it this way, what I've described is like a general orientation for the project. This does not mean that there are tactical interventions at particular moments that can be precisely about, there's, 15 households that have X problem. Let's move that to the municipality to see that what we can do, or to AIA to see what we can do. So at points, there's an intervention in that regards as well. Due to the pragmatics and political demands of the everyday. But in terms of research and academic structuring, I think that idea of convocar through something that is maybe not as charismatic as a mountain, as a river, but something that is still charismatic and interesting to them plays an important role in how you structure your objects of investigation and the kinds of arguments that you want to make, and how you present and talk about your collaborators in circumstances like this. That was all very abstract. I hope it resonated practically. I mean, last thing I'll say, if you want to think about it practically, it's the movement from the sponge to the model to the graph. Right, and how might that movement reveal what each of these artifacts does in the world, and how to recognize that they're all in the world of these communities that I'm thinking with, and they allow different things.
Sure that all of the valves into the water tank are closed. The valve is closed.
And so that movement is very practically, ethnographically, empirically, how all of those very general things that I said translate into a research practice.
Thank you, and Andrea. I think that the convocar through images and the pragmatics of imagination is probably something that here my colleagues are really curious about. So I'm just gonna say that maybe the order could be maybe Lisa, Paul, Matthew, and Jamila.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrea. I really enjoyed the Spongy and malleable talk, and the richness of the materials that you showed us, and particularly the amount of places you invited us to journey to within this big archive of essentially how we're calling forth, convocando, images that help us decipher our way of being in a world and how we relate to it. And this is essentially, I think, what you're getting at. And it's so very important in this work to have this historical focus of decentering that static visual figuration of the world. And I was really appreciative of the fact that you didn't use the word representation, but mediation when you talked about aquifers, and then need to be mediated by virtue of their very opacity, right? And so their indeterminacy, part of its kind of appearance in the world for us, is precisely this resistance to representation, which is, we all know has been like the modality of capture that's been most aesthetically in the arts, but also kind of techno-scientifically rolled out at the service of extractive capitalism. So I think that I found really intriguing the model And the idea of the sponge, less as like the literal sponge itself, but how it enables us to imagine through our own porosity as well, right? Our own embodied leakages and kind of filtration systems, how we start to have that connectivity, which is integrally important to any project in the environmental humanities, which is inviting us to rethink that place that we occupy, right, and in relation. And so that mediation, of course, happens not just in the arts, but very productively as you're inviting us to see in the way people attend to their living environment. And when we were chatting before coming in, and I think Kathy asked you if you were going to share sound, and you said no. I was like, oh, what a shame, because I've seen the model and I assumed it was going to be a video, and thought how delicious to imagine the sound of that filtering and the importance of that level of attention and the expansion of our sensory aliveness to that world that we're in conversation with. So I would be interested to hear you reflect upon what other forms of sensory knowledge are really important to the people you're working with, insofar as they're, embedded in these places. And, I loved the image of the well, this charismatic object of kind of, you can imagine putting your ear up to it as a sound channel, right? Rather than just this kind of object that is statically evoked in your image, but has this whole life world and its own aesthetic capacity, right, for inviting us in. So, is it listening? Is it touch? The sponge is, of course, something very tactile to be thinking with. How do other senses come in and help this mission to move beyond the visual as this dominant way of knowing the world?
And maybe for sake of time, we can add Paul's question or comment.
Sure. Thanks, Alejandro. Thanks so much, Andrea, for your talks. Really fascinating. So, I guess if Lisa's question is about senses, mine's kind of about spaces. So I was really struck with the model of the kind of well, there are lots of models, but the model of the aquifer and the idea of storytelling and the different scales at which you're operating. And also by how you framed your talk at the beginning as a kind of as your work as in a sense of connecting kind of the pre-modern understandings of the subterranean with modern projects. So I'm kind of interested in asking you that question, but in a spatial sense. So you're working with lots of different communities across Costa Rica. So I guess my question is sort of how big is the sponge, right? This conversation that you're involved in, these communities that you're thinking with. Are they thinking, what scales are they thinking at, right? Is it at the local, at the national, at the regional, beyond? I'd be really, really interested to hear your reflections on that.
Thank you. So I'll try to keep my answers shorter so that we can have more time for Jamile and Matthew. Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, I decided to not add the sound part of the performance of the model, really just because of a technical issue. I just was worried about sound coming through properly. But your question, I think it's beautiful because it allows me to speak about two things. One is this. I'm really interested in thinking about the sensorial or the sensory, drawing squarely or very directly from disability studies and what I've learned from disability studies in terms of a non-essential understanding of the senses, or a non-essentializing, I should say. An essentializing, an objectified notion of the senses would say, oh, you hear with your ear, you touch with your skin, you smell with your nose, right? And what I've learned from disability studies is about the impossibility of those partitions and the way in which the senses move across each other. So, and work together to then produce something that we might describe as listening or sound or a smell. And this is something that I began to think about in connection to that project by the USGS, when one of the scientists was explaining the role of sensory devices, but or sensing devices, I should say. But he was speaking about satellites. And then immediately he moved to say, but your bodies are sensors as well. So you should think about satellites as you think of your bodies when they do all of this sensing. And that in that piece of work, I started thinking about the idea of touching with light, for instance, where you touch through vision, as an example. I have all of these amazing recordings. I've been doing some experiments on the Caribbean coast, capturing sound and sounds of things that are supposed to be very different. So the sounds, for instance, of a pump that one of these community organizations uses, extracting water, ends up being very, very similar to the sound of an intense river flowing through. Just the sound objects. And so when putting those two together in a way that refuses what we would love to do, which is to naturalize the river into this charismatic thing, and then think about the pump as this bad thing that signifies extractivism, when you put these two sounds together, that becomes really difficult to do. And so those are ethnographic moments that I'm drawing on to try to build a story of that, of what the sensorial can do that is not representation, as you very nicely put it. It's not that the sound is going to give me a more accurate representation of a river. It's that through sound, I can learn something different. It has been my orientation, but all of this is in the making. So I can only speak of these experiments that I've been doing to try to push myself in that regard. And in connection to the scale question, so one of the hydrogeologists that I've been working with, one time we're having a conversation about aquifer systems and where their borders are. And at some point he said, you know what? You should just think that Costa Rica is one big aquifer, right? And amazing, beautiful, right? At the same time, the hydrogeological studies that they produced for Rio Blanco, and I wish I could show you the image now, are from that area that I showed you. They focused on this smaller aquifer in the middle. So the scale really shrunk, if you will, if we think about scale in terms of size. And so what I'm trying to say is that people move around scales all the time. When they're thinking about the bills that they have to collect, people in the Community Aquifer Association think at a particular scale. When they think about the health of the aquifer, they think at a different scale. When they think about the role of the government in supporting what they do, they think at another scale. When they think about their colleagues on the Pacific side, they're thinking at another. So I began to think about the question of scale, not in terms of size, but in terms of proximity. And it's something that I'm playing with, is how close do people think to certain preoccupations? And using that as a way to think about scale, although, of course, I'm concerned with kilometers and meters and those things, because in their daily work, they're really concerned with those things. Like 100 meters of pipe has a certain cost. 2 kilometers of pipe has another cost. And so that scalar difference has intense implications for what they are able or not able to do.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can go with Matthew's questions and Jamila's.
Yes, thank you, Andrea, and it's nice to chat sort of in person. But firstly, thank you for the amazing presentation. I'm always fascinated and sort of in awe of your work. A quick question around I think it has some bearing from Paul's question and your response. But when we look downwards, this kind of vertical turn in anthropology, I'm interested in how, as you've historically argued, the underground is a form of infrastructure, it connects, and what kind of possibilities emerge from the opacity of aquifers? What kind of possibilities emerge for people thinking in relation to each other across distances, across geographies, when one lives, as aquifers are often quite extensive? Are there relationalities between people and the water, but also people in different parts of a certain area? I'm interested in how there might be ways in which activists, as you responding on your methodology, but how activists can use your work and how usable one's research is by activists. So it's a form of agency from activists as well. How the aquifer, as unknown, as opaque, as unseen, can actually act as agentic. It can work as a collaborative and relational, as a relational device. Yeah, thank you very much, Andrea, and
thank you. That's wonderful. The uses and the generativities of opacity. I wish I had I haven't thought very carefully about this, so I'm going to give you a first reaction, but it's something that I'm going to keep thinking about. The first thing I'll say is that one of the reasons, one of the effects of this opacity and the fact that this opacity is generalized, so it's not that certain experts can really know what is going on here and communities just don't know, right? They both operate in this world of opacity. Hydrogeologists, the first thing that they say is we can never see. And the thing that we have the most of is unknowns, because this is a science that is unable to capture all the data that you would need to reduce uncertainty in scientific terms, so that you can make so that you can be sure about your arguments or the empirics that you're presenting. We're always operating with a high level of uncertainty. And I think that is not to erase hierarchies of power, not to erase hierarchies of state making and all of those things, but I think the fact that hydrogeology is so clear and so upfront about its own limitations as a science creates a condition that opens up dialogue in a different kind of way than, say, topography, for instance, where you can say it is this distance and it is this area, right? And I have the truth because I've measured it. Hydrogeologists don't always talk that way. They say, well, what we know at this moment is X, but you got to remember that there's all of these things that we don't know. And so I like to begin with the opacity of the science itself, because it opens the door for a kind of collaboration with scientific practice that is exciting to me, in terms of, I forget, I think it was Alejandro or somebody else mentioned, when we're thinking about not only who is convocando, who is summoning, but also who is summoned or who is convocado, right? It's not only the people that are moved by this proposal of building alternate worlds, but it can also be the people that we see as being part of this state-making, extractivist, capitalist legacy. There are people there that we also need to summon if we're going to deal with this world in a different way. And so in my work, I've always been really interested in who are those people that are in the quote-unquote powerful structures that might be summoned, that we might convocar, and what are the grounds on what we might do that. And I think opacity and this inability to act as if you fully knew. We know that none of the sciences fully know, but some of them act as if they fully know. Hydrogeologists don't always act that way, and that hence it's a really exciting set of interlocutors, allies, collaborators, friends that you can think and act with. I don't know if I fully answered, but thank you. That's really, really great, and I will continue to think about that.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was really inspiring and stimulating. So I really appreciate the opportunity, to listen to you. You mentioned drawing on Sylvia Wynter's deciphering practices, right? Thinking with her idea of what meaning does in the world. And I found that very interesting, as it helps us consider how meanings are operationalized in the world, and the sponginess between meaning making, sense making, and world making around Aquifers. And as I was listening to you, I also thought of J.L. Austin's How to Do Things with Words, right? And where the emphasis is on what speech acts do rather than simply on what they mean, right? And his argument that certain statements don't just describe the world, but actively change it. And yes, I was thinking about Wynter's deciphering practices and how they also suggest that meanings are dynamic forces that actively shape our world. I guess this is the point that I was hoping you could expand on. And let us know more about how that inflects your approach to what counts as critical thinking. And if you see any relationship between that and Wynter's reconceptualization of the human, like her concern with the concept of the human as too narrow and rooted in coloniality. And yeah, thank you very much again.
Thank you. That's great. Well, absolutely. There's a connection there in terms of the preoccupation of documenting more than doing more than a taxonomic accounting of meanings, but thinking about the way in which semiotic contents, if we want to call them that way, are inscribed and shape the world. But what I would say is that essay where Wynter is thinking about this, it's an amazing essay. It's really hard to read. I've read it a number of times and I'm still learning from it. But it's an essay where she's thinking about how aesthetic practices, Black aesthetic practices, or representations of Black life in aesthetic forms end up being inscribed neurologically. So inscribed, like doing things to our brains, so that we come to understand only, so that we come to reproduce certain patterns that allocate life and death, good and bad, in predictable ways. And of course, you might imagine, Black communities are always ghettoized and are on the pole of the bad or of the lacking of the etc. And so what I love about her essay is that she's saying a deciphering practice is one that helps us spot those patterns in aesthetic practices. And this is where she and Austin share a lot, although Austin is not thinking in terms of brains. But then what comes next is what is unique to Wynter, which is the point is not merely to diagnose that is the meaning existing in the world. Then the point is to say what are its consequences and how might those be changed. So that's the political invitation to, if it's not that, then what is it? So if, to just give a very, very small example that I don't know leaves up to Winter's work, but you could say that identifying the pattern is that first geological image that I showed you, standard layers, right? And that does things in the world. It creates extractivism, or not it creates, but it allows for an extractivist mindset to operate and so on and so forth. And that's Austin up until there. But then Winter says, okay, you've noted that. How are you going to change it? What comes next? What is different? And in my case, that's the attempt to go to the sponge and the muddle and the other things. And that going to something else should incorporate what you have learned are the things, the negative implications or the predictable patterns of allocating life and death that are imbued in that original one. So you should be aware of these and try to do something different, to not allocate patterns of meaning shaping the world in the same way. Because if you do the same thing, then you are contributing to that, to use her material, to that ingraining in our brains of the same pattern that we have noted is an unjust, a racialized, colonizing, so on and so forth. So that was a lot. It's how I make sense of that essay, but I really love that it is not the performativity argument only. It is, yes, performativity, but what is your response to that and how you're going to change that? And that's the political invitation that she makes that Austin doesn't make, I think, but maybe I'm mistaken about that.
Hey, thank you very much, Andrea, for your time. This has been a really generative conversation for many of us. Just want to make a little note. So zones of emergence in environmental humanities are taking forms by crossing disciplines, knowledge territories. This confluence are making practices and research quite amphibious in their themes, but also in their analytics and methods. Andreas's work is inviting us to consider precisely this amphibious analytics that are convocando, to keep the word that we've been playing with, convocando ecological knowledge, adaptive strategies, creative resilience that are enabling ways to living in an intermittent present. So in the face of these pressing issues that are carried across Latin America, climate change, attacks to diversity, resource scarcity, the 2024 Germination series highlights the ways in which communities are resisting, safeguarding their distinctive coexistence across amphibious worlds. I wanted to invite you to the next Germinations event that is happening on May 30th, same time, 5 to 6, chaired by Jamile. I have to excuse myself if I mispronounce surnames. She's going to be joined by Fernando Sektowick and Maeve Jenkins. And it's going to be a conversation that aims to articulate critical vocabularies surrounding environmental film, focusing on the harmful consequences of utilitarian imageries of water and earth. So hope to see you on the 30th. Thank you very much for joining us today.